Everyone in the world right now, including the United States, although here it's done quietly, is readjusting to an altered world economy. There are now two poles of power and wealth, not one. And if you pretend otherwise, if you don't understand it, you will make miscalculations like the war in Ukraine has made. You'll make decisions about sanctions that are stupid. They're just stupid because the people in Washington, I know many of them, they're perfectly smart, but they have blinders on, don't want to face what I just said, how the world has changed and how it isn't going to go away anytime soon. By the way, the gap between the BRICS and the G7, they were roughly equal in 2020. Now the GDP added up, 29% of world GDP is in the G7. 33% is in BRICS. Bingo. BRICS is bigger, and the gap gets worse each year, including right now. So that's the reality that's changing everybody's behavior. After World War II, the dollar became virtually universally recognized as the global currency, basically playing the role in the world that once was played by the British pound, say in the 19th century or early part of the 20th. Central banks in virtually every country held as reserves to support their own currency gold and the dollar, leading to the very famous phrase, the dollar is as good as gold. Yes, exactly. Saudi Arabia and the oil countries adopted the program of selling oil around the world to any buyer, but only for dollars, and then parking those dollars in New York City banks or in U.S. treasuries. It became the focus. And there are enormous benefits to that. The United States, for example, was able to pay for the goods and services produced around the world, the French wine, the Japanese computer, the fill in the blank, by sending them dollars. Unlike in other countries, those dollars didn't come back to buy goods and services here. They held on to the dollar because it was useful to them to do so, which means that for 50 years, the United States was able to consume the produce of the world and gave them in exchange little green pieces of paper, our currency, that cost us nothing and are worth, per se, nothing. The benefits of doing this were incalculable. I mean, you couldn't explain American economic well-being in the last 70 years without the role played by the dollar. That's all gone. Today, central banks around the world, depending on the numbers you use, hold reserves only 50% in dollar, instead of the 80 or 90% that was the norm as little as 20 years ago. And so the symbolic meaning of that is enormous. The financial meaning, the real consumption, all of that. Inflation means that prices in general are going up. Not all of them the same rate. Some of them can go down, but the general direction of prices is up. That's all the word inflation means. Okay, step 2 in the logic. If rising prices are an inflation, the next question is, who determines the prices? Answer: employers determine prices. Everyone listening or watching this program knows that if you're an employee, you've never been called into a room to participate in setting prices. That's done by the boss. That's done by the corporate board of directors, the leading managers. It's a tiny group of people. In our country, the U.S. Census Department lists employers 3% of our population. The other 97% are not. Let's be honest. 3% set the prices, 97% pay them and don't set them. Okay, there's no democracy in an inflation. A tiny group of people never elected to the job, which doesn't exist. It's simply understood that if you're an employer, you set the price. You raise it, you lower it, you keep it the same, your business. Okay, so when inflation means employers made the decision. Why did they raise prices? Answer: the same reason they do everything else, to maximize their profits. That's what makes a business successful. So we can answer the question, an inflation happens if and when employers see profit in raising prices. So they do. Okay, that means that inflation is a profit-driven phenomena that hurts the rest of the people who have to pay more for what they used to get for less. And it's great for profits because that's why it's done. All right, the minute you understand that, then you understand that we live in a system whose economic arrangement is the opposite of democracy. We don't democratically decide what things are going to cost in the store. We never did. We have an autocracy. We have an authoritarian economic system that gives a tiny percentage of the people control over the prices we all pay. When they run an inflation, and when we have a mass of people complaining about it, and that's been the United States in the last 2 years, we turn to an institution set up for this called the Federal Reserve, our central bank. And if you look at the charter of the central bank, one of its jobs is to maintain price stability. So right off the bat, when we have an inflation, we know that the Federal Reserve has failed to do one of the two things it was asked to do. So what does the Federal Reserve do? In the case of the United States in the last 2 years, it raises interest rates. Now, for the mass of people, this makes a bad situation worse. In addition to rising prices of my breakfast cereal and my haircut and my computer program, I now have to pay more on my credit card because the interest rate on my balance has just gone up. So this is a solution that makes the problem worse. So I'm here to tell you that it's not the only solution, that the Federal Reserve, in acting in that way, shortcut what should have been the debate. How do we deal with the inflation that the employer class has imposed on us? And we might have then remembered, and I remind people, we might have remembered that a conservative Republican, Richard Nixon, on the 15th of August, 1971, confronting an inflation then, made the following decision, which he announced on TV. As of tomorrow morning, any company that raises its price, we will come for you, we will arrest you, and we will throw you in the clink. And any union that raises your wages or tries to, we will do the same. He declared what came to be known as a wage price freeze. Did it stop the inflation? On a dime, right away, real quick. Did it raise interest rates? No, it chose an alternative policy. We live in a country which not only did not do what it did a few years ago, but acted as if there was no option, that the raising of interest rates was the universally accepted only way to stop it. For people like me, let me assure you, I sat there stunned. Even I'm used to this. And let me add a personal note. I went to the same graduate school and got my PhD from the exact same faculty that granted it to Janet Yellen. She's a classmate of mine. I know what she knows. I learned it from the same professor, reading the same books at Yale University at the same time. So there I'm watching a woman who I know knows the same thing I was taught about inflations and interest rates and wage price freezes, which, by the way, have been used all over the world in many countries over many, many decades. So we have lots of experience with that tool to fight inflation. But we live in a country that can't face most of its economic problems because they too function as distractions from these kinds of real issues. A few years ago, we had shortages. We couldn't get toilet paper. We couldn't get medicines of all kinds. We have shortages right now. The most popular nonsense spoken about shortages in the past was, ready? Supply chain disruptions. Okay, that's a euphemism. That's another way of saying shortages. Now, I can show you shortages across the board, all over the place, virtually every year since 1971. To assign to shortages some sort of role as evidence, at the very least, you'd have to show me that there were more shortages during a time of wage price controls than there were during all those years when there weren't price controls. Let's be honest. Every policy designed to solve any problem turns out to have strengths and weaknesses. Look, I'd be the last one to argue that a wage price freeze didn't have all kinds of problems. Sure. Not particularly the shortages. The more powerful argument at the time, since I follow these things since that time, the biggest problem was escapism. In other words, there was an escape clause. You could apply for an exemption from the wage price freeze. So every corporation went to work, hired the most expensive lawyers imaginable and lobbyists to go to Washington to get an exemption for your firm or your industry. And that leads to all kinds of misallocation. I get all that. But interest rates have that as well. Interest rates have their strengths and weaknesses. One of the weaknesses of the interest rate is we've had elevated interest rates and they didn't prevent our inflation. We're still struggling with an inflation, and there are as many people now saying that prices are going to go back up as there are people saying that they're going to go down. So interest rate is not some magic bullet. It's not some guarantee, but it really hurts a lot of people and it helps others. The bigger your company, the less an interest rate increase is going to hurt you. Because the reason we have central banks, including the Bank of the U.S. and what later became the Federal Reserve at the beginning of the 20th century, was because when we left interest rates to the quote, free market, we got crazy volatility that was extremely dangerous to the stability of the system. We brought in the regulators, we brought in the institution to deal with the ineffectiveness and the danger of not doing it. We're stuck. Because I'm a critic of capitalism, I don't mind telling you that we don't work well without a central bank, and we don't work that well with one. That's a contradiction, but it is not resolved by oscillating back and forth between the two, pretending when you don't have a central bank that getting one will solve your problem makes no more sense than responding to the failures of the central bank by extolling the virtues of a free market. You can't go with either of them.